The story begins not with blood, but with the cold, gray fog of Newcastle upon Tyne in the late 1950s. To understand the monster, we must first look at the cradle, or rather, the lack of warmth that surrounded it. It was May 26, 1957, when Mary Bell entered this world, born into the hard, industrial landscape of northern England. But this was not a joyous arrival. There were no celebrations, no weeping tears of maternal joy. Mary was born to Betty Bell, a 17-year-old girl who was already hardened by a life that had shown her very little kindness. Betty was a woman who worked the street corners, a woman who saw a child not as a gift, but as an anchor, a burden that would drag her down into the silt of the River Tyne. From the very moment Mary drew her first breath, she was an inconvenience. You see, the darkness in Mary didn't just appear out of the ether. It was fed to her, drop by bitter drop, by the very woman who was supposed to protect her. Betty was a volatile creature, prone to disappearances and rages, often leaving little Mary in the care of relatives or simply alone in the shadows of their chaotic home. The local whispers in Scotswood were that Betty had tried to kill the child before she could even walk. It is a terrifying thought, isn't it? A mother, the giver of life, trying to snatch it back. There were stories, hushed and hurried over garden fences, about accidents that seemed too precise to be mere misfortune. When Mary was just a toddler, she fell out of a window. A terrible fall, the kind that stops the heart of any parent who sees it. But for Betty, it was just another Tuesday. There was no frantic rush to comfort, only a cold detachment. Then, there was the incident with the pills. Little Mary, barely old enough to speak properly, was found having swallowed a handful of sleeping tablets. It was dismissed as a child's curiosity, a mistake. But those who looked closely at the household, those who saw the bruises on the soul of that house, suspected something far more sinister. They suspected that Betty was trying to erase her mistake. Imagine growing up in that house. The walls didn't echo with laughter. They absorbed the sounds of strange men coming and going, the smell of stale smoke and cheap perfume, and the overwhelming, crushing weight of rejection. Mary was often farmed out to relatives, passed around like a parcel nobody wanted to open. At one point, Betty even tried to give her away to a woman who couldn't have children, handing her over as if she were a spare coat. When the family forced Betty to take the child back, the resentment in the house grew so thick you could choke on it. Mary learned very early on that she was unlovable. She learned that the world was a cruel, transactional place where the strong preyed on the weak. She became a bedwetter, a classic sign of deep, unresolved trauma in children, a physical manifestation of her internal chaos. But instead of sympathy, she received mockery. Betty would humiliate her, hanging the wet sheets out for the neighbors to see, shaming the girl, stripping away her dignity layer by layer. By the time Mary reached school age, the lights behind her eyes had dimmed. She was a pretty child, in a rough sort of way, with ribbons in her hair and a deceptive innocence on her face. But inside, the machinery was broken. She had been taught that violence was a language, that indifference was normal, and that empathy was a weakness she couldn't afford. The Scotswood area itself was a grim playground, a place of derelict houses and poverty, but the true wasteland was inside Mary's heart. The soil had been poisoned long before the seed could grow. She was a vessel filling up with a black, icy rage, waiting for the moment it would spill over. And as she approached her 10th birthday, that cup was nearly full. As Mary grew older, The poison that had been fed to her began to seep outward, staining everything she touched. By 1968, the landscape of her life was as fractured as her mind. The family lived in Scotswood, an area that was slowly being chewed up and spat out by urban decay. Rows of terraced houses were being condemned, windows smashed, and families moved out, leaving behind a skeletal ghost town of brick and dust. It was known locally as a rough patch, a place where people kept their heads down. But for Mary, this crumbling wasteland was a kingdom. The derelict buildings, the piles of rubble, and the dark, hidden corners of the construction sites became her playground. It was here, among the debris of other people's lives, that Mary began to practice the terrifying games that would soon horrify the nation. She was not like the other children in the schoolyard. While others played tag or skipped rope, Mary's games had a jagged edge to them. At school, she was a disruptive force, a small tornado of unpredictable violence. She would pinch, bite, and lie with a straight face that unnerved even the most experienced teachers. But it was more than just schoolyard bullying. There were incidents that, in hindsight, were flashing red warning lights that everyone ignored. On one occasion, she placed her hands around the throat of another student, squeezing until the girl gasped for air. When pulled away, Mary didn't cry or apologize. She just stared, cold and unrepentant, claiming it was just a joke. To her, pain was a currency, and she was learning how to spend it. It was during this time that she formed a bond with a neighbor, a girl named Norma Bell. Despite sharing a surname, they were not related by blood, but they became joined at the hip by something far darker. Norma was 13, 2 years older than Mary, but in terms of maturity and intelligence, the roles were reversed. Norma was often described as simple-minded, easily led, and desperate for a friend. Mary saw this. She saw a vessel she could fill with her own dark ideas, a puppet she could string along. Mary was the dominant force, the ringleader, the little general of their two-person army. Together, they roamed the streets of Scotswood, a pair of mismatched shadows against the gray walls. They spent a lot of time near the Tin Lizzie, a nickname for the local nursery. It was a place meant for safety and play, but Mary viewed it with disdain. She would vandalize the property, breaking things just to hear the sound of the snap, tearing up flowers just to see them die. It was a compulsion to destroy beauty, perhaps because she possessed none of it in her own life. The neighbors began to notice something off about the pair. It wasn't just mischief, it was malice. Mary would tell fantastical lies, stories about her mother being royalty or possessing great wealth, trying to build a wall of fantasy to hide the grim reality of her home life. But the lies often turned aggressive. She would threaten other children, telling them she would hurt them if they didn't do what she said. The power dynamic was intoxicating for her. In her house, she was the victim, the unwanted thing. But out here, on the broken pavement of Scotswood, she was the predator. As May of 1968 approached, the atmosphere around Mary shifted. The games became more physical. She was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far she could go before the world pushed back. She was fascinated by fragility. She wanted to know what happened when things broke, not just objects, but people. The bond with Norma tightened, a secret pact sealed in whispers and giggles that sounded innocent to passers-by, but were anything but. The stage was set in the debris of the city. The demolition sites offered perfect cover. The noise of the city provided a mask, and the general neglect of the area meant that 2 little girls could wander into the darkness without anyone asking where they were going. The shadows of Scotswood were long, and Mary Bell was ready to step into them, dragging the innocent world down with her. It was Saturday, May 25th, 1968. The sky over Newcastle was that familiar slate gray, hanging low over the rooftops of Scotswood. For most children, it was just another weekend of freedom, a break from the classroom. But for Mary Bell, this day held a darker significance. It was the day before her 11th birthday. Most little girls would be dreaming of cake, of presents, of a party with friends. Mary, however, was about to mark the occasion with a ritual of her own making, a transition from a troubled child into something far more terrifying. She was about to give herself a gift that no one else could understand, the power over life and death. The victim was Martin Brown, a sweet-faced little boy of only 4 years old. He was the picture of innocence, a small figure in a world of towering brick and mortar. He lived on the same street as Mary's aunt, a proximity that made him an easy target. Martin was playing, as 4-year-olds do, oblivious to the eyes watching him. He was a trusting soul, too young to understand that danger doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a girl with ribbons in her hair. The location chosen for this grim act was a derelict house at 85 St. Margaret's Road. The neighborhood was full of these empty shells, houses that had been condemned and abandoned, their windows staring out like hollow eye sockets. They were forbidden places, which, of course, made them irresistible to children. Mary lured little Martin into this house. It wasn't a kidnapping in the dramatic sense. There was no screaming, no dragging away in a van. It was just a quiet invitation, a hand held out, a promise of a game or a sweet. Martin, with his trusting nature, followed her up the stairs into the dusty silence of the second floor. What happened next in that empty room is the stuff of nightmares, not because of blood and gore, but because of the sheer, quiet intimacy of the violence. There were no weapons used. No knives, no ropes. Just Mary's hands. She strangled him. At 4 years old, Martin was no match for an 11-year-old fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. It is believed that he didn't struggle much. The attack was likely sudden and overwhelming. The most chilling detail of Martin Brown's death is the silence. In a house surrounded by neighbors, in the middle of the day, a life was snuffed out, and the world just kept turning. He simply ceased to be. Mary left his small body lying on the floor, surrounded by the debris of the abandoned room. She walked away, stepping back out into the daylight as if nothing had happened. Later that day, the body was discovered by 3 local boys who had wandered into the house to play. They saw the small form and ran for help. When the authorities arrived, the scene was confusing. Martin lay there looking almost peaceful. Because he was so young and his skin so soft, the strangulation didn't leave the immediate, garish bruising that one might expect on an adult. There was blood and saliva near his mouth, but no glaring signs of a violent struggle. In a tragic twist of fate that would have deadly consequences, the police and the coroner failed to identify this as a murder. Near the body, they found an empty bottle of aspirin pills. The working theory quickly became that little Martin had found the bottle, swallowed the pills, and died of an accidental overdose or asphyxia. It was a neat, logical explanation that fit the poverty and neglect of the area, kids getting into things they shouldn't. The coroner ruled it an open verdict, citing a lack of evidence of violence. Mary Bell had committed the ultimate crime, and she had gotten away with it completely. She watched the police leave. She watched the family grieve. And in that moment, she learned a dangerous lesson. She was invisible. The authorities, the adults, the smart people, they didn't see her. They didn't see the killer standing right in front of them. The death of Martin Brown didn't satisfy her dark hunger. Instead, the lack of consequences poured gasoline on the fire. She had tasted the power of playing God, and the silence from the police only emboldened her. The monster in the playground had just realized that the fence was open. The weeks following Martin Brown's death were characterized by a silence that was deafening to everyone but Mary Bell. To the community of Scotswood, Martin's death was a tragic accident, a heartbreaking misfortune that befell a local family. But to Mary, this verdict was an insult. It was a denial of her power. She had taken a life. She had crossed the ultimate line, and yet nobody noticed. The lack of recognition gnawed at her. A serial killer, even one in the making, often craves the notoriety as much as the act itself. They want the fear. They want the acknowledgement of their terrible capability. Mary was no different. Since the adults wouldn't give her the credit, she decided she would have to demand it. Her behavior in the interim period between the two murders transformed from mischievous to sadistic. She began to haunt the Brown family like a specter. It is hard to imagine a cruelty more profound than what she inflicted on Martin's grieving mother, June Brown. One day, shortly after the funeral, there was a knock at the Browns' door. June opened it to find Mary standing there, her face a mask of polite curiosity. "Can I see Martin?" she asked. The question was like a knife. June, devastated, had to explain that Martin was gone, that he was dead. Mary just stood there, unblinking. "Oh, I know he's dead," she replied. "I wanted to see him in his coffin." She would smile at family members in the street, asking questions about the boy she had killed, feeding on their grief like a vampire feeds on blood. It was a psychological torture, a way to relive the kill over and over again through the pain of those left behind. But the taunting didn't stop at the family's doorstep. Mary and Norma turned their attention back to the local nursery, the Tin Lizzie. This place, meant for the laughter of toddlers, became the canvas for Mary's dark confessionals. On a chaotic night in late May, just days after killing Martin, the two girls broke into the nursery. They trashed the place, overturning furniture and scattering toys. But it wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. They left notes, scrawled in crayon and pencil, that were so chilling they should have stopped the hearts of the police officers who found them. One note, written in a child's jagged hand, read, "I murder so that I may come back." Another declared, "We did murder Martin Brown. Fuck off, you bastard." They even signed some of them, leaving clues that were screaming to be found. The police, however, were blinded by their own assumptions. When they arrived at the vandalized nursery and saw the notes, they dismissed them entirely. They saw them as a sick joke, a prank by unruly teenagers trying to be shocking. They couldn't conceive that a child, a little girl, would write such things and mean them. The misspelling of Martin's name, the crude language, it all just looked like graffiti to them. They ignored the confession staring them in the face because the reality was too horrific to contemplate. Mary grew bolder. The police had seen her confession and laughed it off. This reinforced her belief that she was untouchable, that she was smarter than the adults who ran the world. She walked the streets with a terrifying swagger. She would tell other children about what she had done, weaving the truth into her lies so that no one knew what to believe. "I killed Martin," she would whisper during a game, and then laugh it off when the other kids looked scared. It was a game of cat and mouse, but she was the only one playing. The nursery became a focal point for her aggression. On another occasion, the police found the nursery broken into again. This time, they found something even more disturbing than notes. The girls had committed acts of minor arson, trying to burn the place down. The violence was escalating. The strangulation of Martin had been quiet, clean. Now, there was a need for destruction, for fire, for chaos. Mary was screaming for attention, waving a red flag that was soaked in blood, but the community of Scotswood simply pulled their curtains tighter and hoped the bad kids would just go away. They didn't know that the bad kid was just warming up and that the summer was about to get much, much darker. The monster was loose in the playground, and she was getting bored again. By July 1968, the summer heat had settled over Newcastle, baking the gray streets of Scotswood in a suffocating haze. The schools were out, and the days were long, stretching into warm, sticky evenings. It should have been a time of joy, of ice cream vans and long games of football in the park. But for Mary Bell, the heat only seemed to incubate the darkness growing inside her. The thrill of Martin Brown's death had faded, replaced by a gnawing hunger for something more. The police had called it an accident. The world had moved on. Mary needed to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. She needed to scream her presence in a language that nobody could misunderstand. On Wednesday, July 31st, that scream found its voice. The victim was Brian Howe, a toddler of just 3 years old. Brian was a happy, sturdy little boy with blonde hair, often seen playing near his home on White House Road. He was known for his infectious giggle and his trusting nature, traits that, in the predatory world of Mary Bell, marked him as prey. Late that afternoon, Brian was playing outside with his siblings and a dog. In the blink of an eye, he vanished. He had been approached by Mary and Norma, two older girls he likely recognized from the neighborhood. To a 3-year-old, they weren't strangers. They were just big kids, figures of authority and interest. When they beckoned him to follow them, he trotted along on his little legs, completely unaware that he was walking out of his life. They led him away from the safety of the street, past the houses, and into the overgrown, desolate wasteland known locally as the concrete blocks. This was an industrial dumping ground, a place of weeds, rubble, and concrete slabs, hidden from the prying eyes of parents. It was a perfect killing ground. Once they reached a secluded spot, concealed by long grass and debris, the game ended. The violence that followed was significantly more brutal and frenetic than the silent strangulation of Martin Brown. This was not just about extinguishing a life. It was about defiling it. Mary strangled little Brian. But this time, death wasn't enough. The rage that exploded out of the 11-year-old girl was terrifying in its intensity. After Brian's heart had stopped beating, Mary didn't just walk away. She stayed. She had brought a pair of scissors with her, stolen from her home. What she did next showed a chilling evolution in her pathology. She used the scissors to scratch at the little boy's legs and stomach. In a detail that would haunt the investigators for decades, she attempted to carve initials into his flesh. Some reports stated it was an M, perhaps for Mary, perhaps for Monster, a signature left in blood on the body of an innocent child. She cut off chunks of his hair, a bizarre trophy-taking ritual often seen in seasoned serial killers, not children. They manipulated his body, treating him like a broken doll that they could pose and play with. The scene was one of chaotic violence. Martin Brown had looked like he was sleeping. Brian Howe looked like he had been destroyed. Before they left, they made a clumsy attempt to hide their work, covering the small body with old grass, weeds, and a purple pullover. It was late in the evening when they finally returned home. Mary walked back into her house, washed her hands, and ate her tea as if she had just come back from the park. There was no shaking, no tears, no panic. The dissociation was complete. She had just committed an act of unspeakable savagery, escalating from a silent killer to a mutilator, and yet she sat at the table, a picture of ordinary childhood. Outside, as the sun began to set, the panic in the Howe household was beginning to rise. A mother was calling for her son, her voice echoing down the street. But Brian couldn't hear her. He was lying cold in the wasteland, the second victim of a girl who was rapidly becoming one of the most dangerous people in Britain. The accident theory was about to be shattered forever. This time, the police would have no choice but to see the monster, because she had left her mark carved into the very skin of her victim. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, plunging Scotswood into a murky twilight, but the streets were far from quiet. The disappearance of a 3-year-old boy is an event that galvanizes a neighborhood, pulling fathers from their armchairs and mothers from their doorsteps. The name Brian was being shouted from every corner, a chorus of desperation rising into the night air. The community, already on edge from the whispers of tragedy that seemed to cling to the area, mobilized with a frantic energy. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping over back alleys, coal sheds, and the overgrown patches of wasteland that bordered the estate. But as the hours ticked by, the hope that Brian had simply wandered off to a friend's house began to curdle into dread. It was just past 11 p.m. when the search party reached the concrete blocks. The area was a desolate stretch of industrial waste, a graveyard of forgotten building materials and high weeds that whispered in the wind. A searcher, his beams sweeping across the rough terrain, spotted something that didn't belong. It was a mound of grass and weeds, piled too deliberately, too neatly to be natural. Pushing aside the vegetation, the beam of light fell upon the purple pullover, and then the devastating reality of what lay beneath. There, amidst the rubble, lay the small, lifeless body of Brian Howe. The discovery sent a shockwave through the search party that was almost physical. This wasn't a child sleeping. This wasn't a child who had fallen. The scene screamed of violence. The police were summoned immediately, their sirens slicing through the heavy night air, turning the search site into a crime scene bathed in rotating blue lights. When the seasoned detectives arrived, the air shifted. The casual dismissal that had marred the Martin Brown investigation vanished instantly. This was visceral. This was undeniable. The body had been partially concealed, a clear sign of guilt, a sign that someone had tried to hide their sin. But it was the condition of the body that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened officers. This was not a clean death. The post-mortem examination would later reveal the full extent of the horror, the strangulation, the scratches, the crude attempts at mutilation with the scissors that lay nearby. The playful, accidental veneer was gone. Scotswood was no longer just a poor neighborhood. It was a hunting ground. The police knew immediately they were dealing with a murder, and given the savage nature of the injuries, they assumed they were looking for a maniac. A monster. The news broke the next morning like a thunderclap. Child killer loose in Newcastle. The headline screamed the fear that every parent felt in their gut. The atmosphere in Scotswood transformed overnight. The streets that were once filled with the noise of children playing stickball and tag fell silent. Mothers gripped their children's hands until their knuckles turned white. Doors were locked. Curtains were drawn. A heavy blanket of suspicion descended on the city. Neighbors looked at neighbors with wary eyes. Men who lived alone, strangers passing through, anyone who didn't fit the mold became a suspect. The police launched a massive manhunt. They drafted in officers from surrounding areas, setting up a mobile headquarters. They were looking for a man, a strong, deranged man. The profile they built in their heads was of a sexual predator or a violent psychopath. They were looking for someone with the strength to strangle and the depravity to mutilate. They interviewed thousands of people. They knocked on every door in the estate. They stopped cars. They scoured the records for known offenders. And all the while, the true killer was watching from behind the curtains of a house just a few streets away. Mary Bell watched the police cars swarm the neighborhood with a detached fascination. She saw the fear in the adult's eyes, the panic that she had orchestrated. It must have felt like a godlike power to a girl who had always felt small and ignored. The police were turning the city upside down looking for a giant, completely blind to the fact that the maniac they sought wore white socks and played with dolls. The investigation was massive, frantic, and fundamentally flawed, because the detectives simply could not conceive that the evil they were hunting was sitting in a classroom, singing hymns and drinking milk. The city was in fear of a phantom, while the real danger stood right beside them, asking for a sweet. As the dragnet for the Scotswood monster tightened around the adult population of Newcastle, Mary Bell began to make her first fatal mistakes. A serial killer's greatest weapon is anonymity, the ability to blend into the background. But Mary didn't want to blend in. She wanted to be the star of the show. Her narcissism, that deep, bottomless need for attention that had been starved since birth, began to override her instinct for self-preservation. She and Norma didn't hide in their rooms. They inserted themselves directly into the center of the investigation, fluttering around the grieving families and the exhausted police officers like moths drawn to a flame. It started with small, peculiar interactions. Mary would approach police officers standing guard or patrolling the streets. With a bright, innocent smile, she would ask, "Have you caught him yet? Or do you think he'll come back?" It seemed like childish curiosity to the weary constables, but there was a glint in her eye, a breathless excitement that was entirely inappropriate for the somber mood of the neighborhood. She was mocking them. She was standing face to face with the law, armed with the knowledge of where the bodies were buried, daring them to figure it out. Then came the funeral of little Brian Howe. It was a day of crushing sorrow for Scotswood. The community turned out in black, heads bowed, weeping for the 3-year-old boy whose life had been so cruelly snatched away. But amidst the sea of tears, there was one dry-eyed observer. Mary Bell stood on the sidewalk as the hearse passed by. Witnesses would later recount a chilling sight. While grown men and women cried, Mary was seen rubbing her hands together. She wasn't wringing them in grief. She was rubbing them in glee. She was seen laughing. One neighbor reported her saying, "It's all because of me." At the time, people were too grief-stricken to process what they were seeing, dismissing it as the strange behavior of a disturbed child. But the image of that little girl smirking at a coffin would sear itself into their memories forever. The mask truly began to slip when the girl started talking to the police more formally. In an effort to be helpful, or perhaps to frame someone else, Mary and Norma began to spin wild tales. They told detectives they had seen a boy playing with Brian on the day he died. They described an 8-year-old boy with a pair of scissors. This was a critical error. The police had not released the detail about the scissors to the public. It was holdback evidence, a key known only to the killer and the investigators. When Mary mentioned the scissors, the ears of Detective Sergeant Dobson pricked up. How could this little girl know about the weapon used to mutilate the body? The detectives decided to bring the girls in for questioning, not as suspects initially, but as potential witnesses who claimed to have seen this mysterious boy. But as soon as they were separated, the cracks appeared. The bond between Mary and Norma, forged in secrecy, began to crumble under pressure. Their stories didn't align. Mary was confident, almost arrogant, spinning elaborate lies with the ease of a seasoned criminal. She described the boy in detail, gave him a name, gave him a motive. But Norma was different. Norma was terrified. She was simple-minded and easily confused, and she couldn't keep up with Mary's complex web of deceit. When the police pointed out the inconsistencies, Mary didn't panic. She doubled down. She became aggressive, evasive. She tried to dominate the room just as she dominated the schoolyard. But these were Scotland Yard detectives, not school teachers. They saw through the bravado. They saw a child who knew too much, who was too calm, and whose eyes held a darkness that frightened them. The realization began to dawn on them, a slow, creeping horror that turned their blood to ice. They weren't looking for a man. The monster they had been hunting, the savage beast that had terrorized a city, was sitting right in front of them, wearing a dress and swinging her legs on the chair. The investigation pivoted sharply. The focus was no longer on the shadows of the wasteland, but on the two little girls from Scotswood. The game was over. The trap was about to snap shut. The walls of the interrogation room at Newcastle's police headquarters were drab and imposing, designed to intimidate hardened criminals, thieves, and thugs. They were never meant to hold two little girls in pigtails. It was early August 1968, and the atmosphere inside the station was thick with a tension that was almost electric. The detectives, led by Chief Inspector James Dobson, were venturing into uncharted territory. They were used to breaking down liars, but they had never faced a situation where the suspects were children accused of such barbarity. The decision was made to separate them. This is a classic police tactic, divide and conquer. But in this case, it revealed the stark, terrifying difference between a follower and a psychopath. First, there was Norma. In the interrogation room, stripped of Mary's dominating presence, Norma Bell crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. She was terrified, a sobbing mess of confusion and guilt. The pressure of the secret she had been forced to keep was too much for her fragile mind. Under the gentle but persistent questioning of the detectives, the dam broke. She began to scream, her voice shrill with panic. "Mary did it. Mary did it. I saw her." She spilled the details in a frantic torrent, describing how Mary had squeezed the life out of Brian Howe, how she had enjoyed it. Norma painted a picture of herself not as a partner, but as a horrified spectator, trapped by her fear of Mary. She wept for her mother, for her home, begging to be let go. To the detectives, her distress felt genuine. This was how a child should react to murder, with horror and tears. Then, there was Mary. When the detectives walked into Mary Bell's interview room, the temperature seemed to drop. There were no tears. There was no shaking. Mary sat in the chair, her feet barely touching the floor, looking at the seasoned investigators with a gaze that was unervingly steady. She didn't look like a child who had been caught. She looked like a chess player analyzing the board. When told that Norma had confessed and implicated her, Mary didn't flinch. She simply leaned back, a cold sneer curling her lip, and said, "She's a liar." What followed was a psychological duel that would become legendary in British criminal history. Mary didn't just deny the crimes. She spun a new narrative, effortlessly shifting the blame onto Norma. She admitted to being there, a tactical admission to explain away physical evidence. But she claimed she had tried to stop Norma. She painted herself as the hero, the one who tried to save Brian, while casting the sobbing, simple-minded Norma as the mastermind. She spoke of the killing with a clinical, detached precision that made the hair on the detective's arms stand up. She didn't use the language of a child. She used the language of a predator. At one point, the mask of the innocent little girl slipped completely. When pressed on the details, Mary began to describe the mechanics of strangulation. She demonstrated with her own hands how one would squeeze a throat to stop the air. It wasn't a confession of guilt in her eyes. It was a demonstration of knowledge, a way of showing off. She was arrogant. She believed she could outsmart the men across the table. She asked questions about her family, but not "Are they okay?" or "Do they miss me?" Instead, she asked how they were reacting to her fame, how the neighbors were looking at her house. It was pure narcissism. The detectives, men who had seen the aftermath of gang violence and domestic brutality, found themselves deeply disturbed. They realized they weren't talking to a scared kid who had made a mistake. They were talking to a void. There was no conscience there, no empathy to appeal to. When she was finally formally charged with the murder of Brian Howe, and later Martin Brown, her reaction was chillingly mundane. She asked for a crayon and paper. She began to draw. She didn't care about the charges. She was bored. The interrogation solidified the case, but it also confirmed the nightmare. The police had their killer. It wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows of the night. It was the girl who had sat there, swinging her legs, lying to their faces without a single blink. As the heavy door of the cell clicked shut, locking Mary away, the detectives were left in the silence of the room, grappling with a terrifying realization: evil doesn't always have a grown-up face. Sometimes it wears a school uniform. The winter of 1968 brought a bitter chill to Newcastle, but the coldest place in the city was undoubtedly the courtroom of the Newcastle Assizes. In December, the trial that would captivate and horrify the world began. The public gallery was packed, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and morbid curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the monsters. But when Mary Bell and Norma Bell were led into the dock, a hush fell over the room. They looked so small. The dock, designed for adult criminals, swallowed them up. They had to be given cushions just to see over the rail. It was a visual paradox that messed with the heads of everyone present. How could these tiny figures be responsible for such immense darkness? The trial was a surreal spectacle. The legal system, with its wigs, gowns, and archaic language, was ill-equipped to handle an 11-year-old defendant charged with double murder. The girls sat there, swinging their legs, passing notes, and sometimes giggling, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. They looked like they were in detention, not on trial for their lives. Mary, in particular, seemed fascinated by the attention. She scanned the courtroom, making eye contact with the jury, her expression unreadable. She wore a new coat. Her hair was brushed. She looked like any other girl you'd see on a Sunday morning. But as the evidence was presented, that illusion shattered. The prosecution laid out the timeline of horror: the strangulation of Martin Brown, the mutilation of Brian Howe, the notes left at the nursery. The court heard the testimony of the detectives, the details of the confessions, and the chilling behavior of Mary at the funeral. The contrast between the child in the dock and the acts described was nauseating. The most gripping part of the trial, however, was the defense's strategy. Mary's lawyers knew they couldn't deny the physical evidence. Instead, they focused on her mind. They called upon psychiatrists to testify, to peel back the layers of Mary's psyche. The diagnosis was damning. They described her as having a psychopathic personality. This was a heavy label to pin on a child. It meant she lacked a conscience, that she was incapable of feeling guilt or empathy. They detailed her background, the mother who didn't want her, the neglect, the bedwetting, painting a picture of a damaged vessel that had never been filled with love, only poison. The dynamic between Mary and Norma in the courtroom was telling. Norma was a wreck, sobbing into her handkerchief, terrified of the judge, the jury, and most of all, Mary. Her defense painted her as a simpleton who had fallen under the spell of a dominant, evil personality. Mary, on the other hand, was stoic. When Norma took the stand and wept, Mary watched her with cold contempt. She even heckled her own lawyers at times, showing that same arrogance she had displayed in the interrogation room. She was fighting for control even here, in the High Court of Justice. After 9 grueling days, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The tension in the waiting period was agonizing. When they returned, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The foreman stood up. For Norma Bell, the verdict was not guilty. She collapsed in relief, a victim of Mary's manipulation finally set free. But for Mary, the verdict was different. The jury found her guilty of manslaughter, not murder, on the grounds of diminished responsibility. They accepted that her mind was broken, that she was a product of her horrific environment. The judge, Mr. Justice Cusack, looked down at the small girl who had caused so much destruction. His words were grave. He described her as a dangerous little girl and sentenced her to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. It was an indefinite sentence. There was no date for release. She was to be taken away, locked up until she was no longer a danger to the public, if that day ever came. As Mary was led away, she didn't cry. She didn't scream for her mother. She just walked out, leaving the stunned courtroom behind. The trial was over, but the question hung in the air like smoke. What do you do with a child who kills? Society had locked the door, but the memory of the girl with the ribbons and the dead eyes would haunt Britain for generations. The heavy iron doors of the secure unit slammed shut, sealing Mary Bell away from the world she had terrorized. But for the British legal and penal system, the nightmare was far from over. They were faced with an unprecedented problem. What do you do with an 11-year-old serial killer? She was too young for adult prison, yet far too dangerous for a standard children's home. She became a ghost in the machine, shuffled between secure units, including a boys' reformatory where she was the only female, a singular anomaly in a system designed for bad men, not broken little girls. Her years in custody were not quiet. The manipulation continued. She charmed guards, fought with other inmates, and allegedly attempted to escape. She was a celebrity in the darkest sense, receiving sacks of fan mail from the twisted and the curious. Yet, behind the walls, psychiatrists continued to probe the shattered landscape of her mind. They tried to untangle the wires that Betty Bell had crossed so many years ago. It was a slow, painful process of trying to teach a sociopath the concept of remorse, to retroactively install a conscience where there was only a void. Then came May 1980. After 12 years of incarceration, the decision was made. Mary Bell, now a 23-year-old woman, was deemed no longer a danger to the public. She was released, but she couldn't just walk out as Mary Bell. The name was toxic, It was a lightning rod for hatred, to protect her from vigilante justice, and perhaps to give her a chance at the redemption she had denied her victims. The High Court granted her a rare and controversial privilege, anonymity. Mary Bell effectively ceased to exist. In her place, a new woman was born, with a new name, a manufactured history, and a passport to a life she hadn't earned. She moved away, found a job, and eventually became a mother herself, a grandmother now, living among us, perhaps shopping in the same supermarkets, walking in the same parks. The Scotswood monster had dissolved into the crowd. But for the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, there was no release date. June Brown and the Howe family were left to serve a life sentence of grief. Every birthday, every Christmas, every empty chair at the table was a reminder of what had been stolen. The injustice of it burned like acid. In the late 1990s, the wound was ripped open again when it was revealed that Mary had collaborated on a book about her life, Cries Unheard, and had been paid for her story. The outrage was volcanic. The idea that the killer was profiting from her crimes while the mothers of the victims still wept was a moral obscenity that shook the nation. It forced laws to change, preventing criminals from profiting from their memoirs. But the money had already been paid, and the pain had already been inflicted. Today, the story of Mary Bell remains one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. It forces us to look into the abyss and ask the most uncomfortable question of all: are monsters born, or are they made? Was Mary a seed of pure evil, or was she the inevitable result of a childhood devoid of love? We want to believe that children are innocent, that they are blank slates. Mary Bell shattered that belief. She showed us that a child can look like an angel but harbor the devil inside. As the fog clears from the streets of Scotswood, the physical scars of the 1960s are gone. The derelict houses are demolished, the Tin Lizzie is a memory, but the shadow remains. Somewhere in Britain, an elderly woman is living out her final years, carrying the secret of the girl she used to be. And somewhere in the quiet corners of a cemetery in Newcastle, two little boys sleep eternally, forever 4 and 3 years old, victims of a game that went too far. The story ends here, but the chill it leaves behind never truly goes away.